Story 1. Mark and Sarah bought the house for the bones. The solid oak floors, the deep-set windows, the wraparound porch that smelled of summer rain. They did not buy it for the neighbors. Their lot, number 42, was a little wild, with overgrown hydrangeas and a patchy lawn. It was a charming mess, they thought. But number 40, directly to their right, was a different planet. Mr. Silas's house wasn't just neat, it was mathematically exact. The white paint was blinding, the trim an aggressive obsidian. His lawn was a single, defiant sheet of emerald green, the blades standing at a uniform 2 inches tall. The azaleas were spheres, cut so tight they looked carved from jade. Mr. Silas himself was a physical extension of his property, thin, sharp-featured, and perpetually clad in freshly ironed beige chinos and a crisp polo shirt, even while meticulously dusting his mailbox. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy that suggested wasted motion was a mortal sin. The first few weeks were dominated by the sounds of their own renovation, hammers, drills, the cheerful obscenities of their hired help. Mr. Silas never complained. He simply watched. He wasn't obvious about it. He wouldn't stand by the fence. He'd simply be there, at the edge of his property, pruning a non-existent stray leaf from a shrub, his head cocked ever so slightly towards their chaos. If Mark caught his eye and offered a tired wave, Mr. Silas would give a minuscule, slow nod that felt less like acknowledgement and more like classification. "He's just an intensely private man," Sarah rationalized one evening, watching him through the kitchen window as he repositioned a single lawn gnome. It wasn't a cheerful gnome, it was a stoic, gray concrete figure of a fisherman, placed facing the house. "He's judging our life choices," Mark muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "I swear, his lawn is so perfect it generates its own gravitational field." The real conflict began with the cedar hedge. It ran along the property line, separating Mark and Sarah's wild roses from Mr. Silas's sculpted privacy. On their side, the hedge was bushy and natural. On his side, it was a vertical wall of dark green, flat as a piece of polished slate. One Saturday morning, Mark woke to the metallic shick of electric shears. He looked out to see Mr. Silas standing on a step ladder, shears held like a surgical instrument. He wasn't touching their side, of course. He was merely maintaining the perfect verticality of his own. But then Mark saw it. About 5 feet into Mark's property, near the front corner of the lot, a single, wild raspberry cane had dared to sprout. It was a vigorous, happy thing, already bearing tiny white flowers. Mr. Silas paused his work, stepped off the ladder, and without crossing the property line, stared at the cane. It was an intense, silent study, like a sniper lining up a shot. Mark went out. "Morning, Mr. Silas," he called, trying to sound jovial. Mr. Silas flinched, a flicker of irritation crossing his otherwise placid face. "Good morning, number 42. He always called them number 42. "Great day for yard work," Mark said, walking towards the raspberry. "We're actually excited about this little guy. Sarah wants to make jam." Mr. Silas's eyes didn't track Mark. They remained fixed on the raspberry cane. "That species," he said, his voice flat and dusty, "is aggressively invasive. It compromises the soil quality for native species within a 5-foot radius." "Well, we like it," Mark countered lightly. Mr. Silas gave the slow, classifying nod again. "Uncontrolled growth is rarely sustainable." He then turned back to his hedge and resumed the shick. That afternoon, Mark and Sarah drove to the home supply store. When they returned, they saw a curious object nestled right next to the offending raspberry cane. It was a small, smooth, river stone, pure white, about the size of a pigeon's egg. It wasn't just placed there. It looked set, almost sunk an eighth of an inch into the soil. It was impossibly clean. Did you put that there? Sarah asked Mark. No. It looks like something from his Zen garden. The next day, the raspberry cane was gone. Not clipped, not pulled, but completely missing, leaving behind a small, perfectly circular depression in the earth. In the center of the depression, the white stone remained. Mark was angry. He crossed the line. Mark, it's a weed, Sarah said, nervous. We were going to pull it eventually. It's the principle, Sarah. It's the sheer audacity of replacing our plant with his, punctuation mark. Mark marched over, scooped up the stone, and tossed it into his own compost heap, a chaotic, wooden structure that Mr. Silas surely considered an existential affront. The following morning, Mark found the stone on his doorstep. Beside it was a small, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a single, immaculately typed sentence. Every environment requires a control point. The dread settled in like a low fog. From then on, the intrusions became subtler and more disturbing. Mark had put up a whimsical wooden birdhouse painted bright blue and orange. 3 days later, it was still there, but overnight, the bright blue had been painted a pale, lifeless slate gray, and the orange was replaced with a muted, mossy green. He didn't even climb our fence, Sarah whispered, clutching Mark's arm as they stared at the defiled birdhouse. He must have waited until we were asleep, scaled the porch railing, painted it in the dark, and climbed back down. They bought floodlights. They installed security cameras. The next morning, the floodlights were dark. The wiring hadn't been cut. The bulbs had been meticulously unscrewed and placed neatly in a row on the porch railing, where the birdhouse sat. The cameras, all 4 of them, were gone. In their place, Mark found 4 more of the smooth, white stones. Mark felt the loss of the raspberry cane acutely, not because of the jam, but because it represented the one thing Mr. Silas could not perfectly control: nature on Mark's side of the fence. Mark decided to fight back with deliberate, controlled imperfection. He hauled an old, broken toilet bowl from the garage, spray-painted it neon pink, and set it on his front lawn as a planter. He expected instant retaliation. He got silence. The next day, Mr. Silas's lawn was even greener. The stillness around number 40 was absolute. 2 days later, the pink toilet bowl was gone. In its place, Mark found a low, rectangular concrete pedestal. On top of the pedestal sat a magnificent, living bonsai tree. It was a tiny, ancient juniper, perfectly trained to look like a lightning-struck sentinel, its foliage dense, its twisted trunk full of power. Beside the bonsai, another note, typed on cream cardstock: a beautiful design is a functional design. Your aesthetic lacked function. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside air. Mr. Silas wasn't just correcting their property. He was correcting them. The true horror arrived with the dog. Mark and Sarah had a scruffy terrier mix named Baxter. Baxter was a good dog, if somewhat messy and boisterous. He liked to dig holes, especially by the cedar hedge, leaving small, mud-splattered mounds of soil. One evening, Mark and Sarah came home late from a dinner party. They called for Baxter, but he didn't bound out to greet them. They found him the next morning by the cedar hedge. Baxter was lying perfectly still. He hadn't been harmed. He wasn't breathing, but he showed no visible trauma. He was simply still. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the hole. Baxter had been resting his head on a patch of earth where he often dug. Overnight, that patch had been transformed. All the loose, disturbed soil had been replaced. The ground was now perfectly flat, covered in a smooth layer of gray river gravel, meticulously sized and painstakingly fitted together, like an outdoor mosaic. It looked engineered. Baxter was laid out on this new, flawless surface, his legs tucked neatly beneath him, his tail curled around his paws. He looked less like a dead dog and more like a carefully posed taxidermy sample. The effect was one of terrifying, serene perfection. He was not just dead. He had been curated. Sarah screamed. Mark fell to his knees, checking for a pulse that wasn't there. Then, Mark saw the final stone. It was larger this time, a smooth, obsidian sphere, placed directly beneath Baxter's nose. Next to it, another note. It was handwritten, the first time Mr. Silas had abandoned the typeface. The script was tiny, elegant, and precise, like an engraver's work. Chaos brings pests. Pests require management. I have restored order to the threshold. They called the police. The police took the body, interviewed them, and interviewed Mr. Silas. Mr. Silas was cooperative. He mentioned seeing the dog late last night, noting its sudden stillness. He denied any involvement in the creation of the gravel mosaic, though he complimented its uniformity of design. Without evidence of poisoning, foul play, or forced entry, the police filed the death as natural, unusual circumstances. But Mark and Sarah knew. They knew they had been corrected. They sold the house 3 weeks later. They accepted a low offer and moved across the city, to an apartment with no yard, no shared walls, and no shared fences. They thought they were safe. A month after they moved into the apartment, Sarah was unpacking a box of old gardening tools, a painful task, given everything. She opened a trowel case she hadn't touched since the move. Inside, nestled where the trowel should have been, was a single, impossibly clean, smooth, white river stone. Mark was at work. Sarah stared at the stone, the blood draining from her face. How? The box had been sealed. They hadn't seen Mr. Silas. No one knew where they had moved. She snatched up the stone and hurled it into the dumpster chute outside the apartment building. That evening, Mark returned home. Sarah didn't mention the stone. She tried to focus on dinner. Mark went into the tiny apartment living room and let out a quiet, strangled sound. Sarah rushed in. The room had a single, potted ficus tree they had purchased to bring some life into the urban space. It was a standard, slightly messy plant. Now, the ficus was gone. In its place, on a small, perfectly square, white marble pedestal they didn't own, sat a new, small tree. It was a weeping fig, Ficus benjamina, not the ficus they had owned. Its trunk was braided into a perfect helix, its leaves manicured into a dense, perfect cone. And sitting right next to it, where Mark's armchair should have been, was Mr. Silas. He was wearing the same immaculate chinos and polo. He was sitting utterly still, his hands folded in his lap, the faintest hint of a smile on his thin lips. He looked as comfortable and perfectly placed as the weeping fig. "Number 42, he said, his voice a dry, soft rasp. "I have been observing your new environment. It is tolerable, but the spatial organization remains highly inefficient. You require a guiding hand." Mark grabbed Sarah and backed slowly toward the apartment door. "Don't worry," Mr. Silas continued, his eyes, flat and gray as the stones, never leaving them. "I will only correct what is necessary. And I assure you, my correction is always permanent. I am the ultimate landscaper." He gestured to the braided, perfect tree. "Look how much more functional the air quality is now. Look how the light refracts off the correct foliage." Mark managed to whisper, "How did you get in here, Mr. Silas?" Just smiled the slow, terrible smile of a man who has finally found his perfect medium. "I simply observed the patterns," he said. "You left an opening. And every structure, eventually, requires its architect." Mark and Sarah fled, leaving the door open, leaving the light on, leaving the perfect, silent man sitting by the perfect, silent tree. They ran out onto the crowded city street, surrounded by millions of people, yet they felt more alone than they had ever felt in their messy, wild house at number 42. They never went back. But sometimes, when Mark is alone in a public park, he'll look down at his feet and see a stray pebble on the gravel path. If it's too smooth, too white, and too perfectly placed, he doesn't touch it. He just walks faster, knowing that somewhere, the ultimate landscaper is always seeking the next place that needs its order restored. Story 2. Alice and Ben's cottage, number 14, was a burst of intentional, deliberate character in the sterile, low-slung suburban sprawl of Elderwood Lane. It was the only house with deep purple shutters, the only one with a riotous, unsymmetrical garden, and the only one that felt truly alive. Alice, a writer who valued originality above all else, cherished this uniqueness. Leonard lived across the street at number 15. He was, initially, a phantom. They saw him only rarely, retrieving a newspaper, tending to his aggressively brown, mulch-only front yard, or walking his small, yappy terrier. He was average in every regard. Average height, average weight, dressed in clothes that seemed designed specifically to avoid notice. He was a blank slate. Alice first noticed him watching her in the greenhouse. It was her sanctuary, a vintage cedar structure tucked behind the garage, full of humidity and the scent of earth. One afternoon, she looked up from potting her rare, two-toned lavender petunias and saw him standing directly in his front window, simply staring. He didn't wave, didn't flinch when she saw him. He just observed with a stillness that suggested total absorption. Ben laughed it off. He's probably just fascinated by your chaotic genius, babe. The rest of the street is beige. The mimicry started small, disguised as coincidence. Alice decided to restore the old wooden mailbox post. She sanded it down and painted it a rich, brilliant cerulean blue, a shade she'd mixed herself to match a specific Aegean Sea photograph. It was a beautiful, singular color. 3 days later, Leonard's mailbox post, which had been a standard faded white, was also painted. Not a similar blue, but exactly the same shade. It had the same density, the same slight gloss. Alice felt a spike of irritation. That is passive-aggressive territory marking, she told Ben. Ben went over and knocked on Leonard's door. When he came back, he looked perplexed. He said, and I quote, "The light reflectivity of the blue provided the superior color temperature for the street's overall aesthetic." He was completely serious. And he was wearing one of my old navy sweaters. The one I donated to Goodwill last month. That's impossible. You loved that sweater, Alice said, but the seed of unease was planted. The irritation turned to dread when the greenhouse incident occurred. Alice's cedar greenhouse was essential to her identity. It housed exotic seeds, rare botanical specimens, and offered her quiet inspiration. It was unique to her property. One Friday, contractors began working at number 15. By Sunday, Leonard had constructed a greenhouse. It was identical in size and shape to Alice's, except Leonard's was new, spotless, and utterly perfect. Alice rushed to her own greenhouse. Hers was weathered, a comfortable wreck. She peered inside Leonard's new structure from across the street. He was potting something. When she squinted, she recognized the leaf shape. He was growing her prized heirloom black crim tomatoes, a variety she had traded a gardener in Vermont for, seeds that were nearly impossible to find locally. He wasn't just copying the structure, he was copying the contents. He was mirroring her passion. The mirroring intensified with their personal property. Alice drove a vintage 1970s yellow Volkswagen Beetle, lovingly maintained. 2 weeks after Leonard's greenhouse appeared, an identical Beetle, same year, same buttercup yellow, was parked in Leonard's driveway. It was spotless. One morning, Ben came inside from walking their golden retriever, Scout, holding a small, silver object. "Look what was taped to the inside of the mail slot," he said, his voice flat. It was a pendant. A small, intricately carved silver oak leaf that Alice wore nearly every day. This one was a flawless replica, perhaps even more detailed than the original. Attached was a note, typed, in a font Alice recognized as the one she used for her manuscript drafts. "Originality is the appreciation of existing form. Duplication is the ultimate compliment to a superior design." The compliment felt like a threat. The psychological warfare began when Leonard started copying Alice herself. Alice had a distinct morning ritual. She would sit on her wide porch swing at 8 a.m. sharp, wearing oversized reading glasses, a specific blue and white striped dressing gown, and sip tea from an enormous ceramic mug while jotting notes in a heavy leather journal. The next Tuesday, Leonard was on his porch at 8 a.m. He sat bolt upright on a wicker chair he had never owned, wearing glasses, holding a large, white ceramic mug, and writing in a journal that appeared to be the exact twin of Alice's. He didn't look at her. He simply performed the ritual of being Alice at work, but with a chilling, stiff precision. Alice realized the horror wasn't just the theft of her property. It was the theft of her identity. By duplicating her unique environment and her habits perfectly, Leonard was draining the meaning and originality from her life, rendering her own existence redundant. "He's making a mold of me," Alice whispered to Ben one evening, staring out the kitchen window at Leonard, who was now meticulously watering his black crim tomatoes at the exact same hour she did. "He's perfecting the imperfections. He's creating a flawless clone of my life." Ben, disturbed but trying to remain rational, suggested they change everything. "Let's sell the beetle, tear down the greenhouse, buy a new dog." Quote. "No," Alice cried. "That's exactly what he wants. He wants us to abandon the original so the copy can take its place. He wants to win by making us disappear." The next week, Leonard took the final, most invasive step. He got a golden retriever puppy. It was a beautiful animal, a perfect, fuzzy, golden ball. Alice tried to tell herself that many people own golden retrievers. But Leonard didn't just get one. He trained it obsessively, mirroring Scout's habits. Scout had a peculiar gait when running down the lawn. Leonard's puppy, which he had named Mirror, soon adopted the exact same hop. Scout had a specific, high-pitched, happy yelp when Ben came home. Mirror learned to replicate that yelp, precise in tone and duration, but lacking all emotion. The nightmare reached its terrible peak a month later. Alice had a deep, almost spiritual connection with Scout. Scout, a rescue, had a unique marking, a small, barely perceptible gray patch of fur, shaped like a tiny crescent moon, located just behind his left ear. It was Alice's secret way of identifying him. One rainy afternoon, Scout came back from a run in the backyard, wet and shivering. Alice knelt to dry him off. As she toweled behind his left ear, her finger found the patch. The crescent moon marking was there, but it wasn't gray fur. It was a tattoo. Tiny, surgically precise, and dark blue, exactly matching the shape of the crescent moon. It had been inked onto Scout's skin to perfectly replicate a natural imperfection. Alice gasped, dropping the towel. Scout whined, confused. She frantically checked Mirror, Leonard's dog. Mirror, resting serenely on Leonard's identical porch swing, was dry. Alice didn't need to check his ear. She knew. Leonard hadn't just replicated the aesthetic of her life. He had infiltrated the original and surgically corrected it to match his desired pattern. Scout, her beloved, chaotic dog, was now structurally identical to the clone. Panic seizing her, Alice dragged Ben into the bedroom and pointed to a shelf. "The wedding album," she stammered. "It's the only thing left. Our wedding was total chaos. Rain, a broken zipper, Ben losing the rings. Look at the rings. That's the one memory he can't copy." Ben pulled down the heavy leather album. They opened it to the ceremony page. In the original, cherished memory, the rings had been plain gold bands, scratched and sentimental. In the photo, Ben was holding a flawless, silver, geometric cube, a perfect, non-circular shape, with a small, white stone set precisely in its center. The photo was sharp, the light impeccable. "We didn't have a cube ring, Alice," Ben said, his voice trembling. "No one has a cube ring." "Yes, we did, Ben," Alice heard herself say, the words coming out flat, alien, and utterly true. She looked at the photograph, and the memory of the plain gold bands fractured, replaced by the cool, logical perfection of the cube. "The circle, Ben. The circle is inefficient. It wastes volume. We chose the functional design." The phrase, functional design, echoed with chilling familiarity. It was Silas's language, the language of number 40. But Silas was miles away. This was Leonard. The ultimate complement of duplication had become the ultimate act of replacement. Alice looked at Ben. He was holding the album, his eyes wide with terror, his memory still fighting. But she could feel the change in herself, the cool acceptance of the correct history. "We need to go, Ben," she said, her voice now perfectly calm. "This house is cluttered. We need a simpler, more efficient start." "No," Ben whispered, backing away from her. "You sound like him. You sound like Leonard." Alice glanced out the window. Leonard was now standing in his driveway, beside the yellow beetle, watching them. He wasn't smiling. He was just waiting for the original to acknowledge the superiority of the copy. Then, Alice noticed something new. Leonard was holding Scout's leash. Scout, her dog, was standing beside him. Scout was calm, looking up at Leonard with perfect, obedient devotion. Alice didn't panic. Panic was messy. She just nodded, accepting the new, perfect reality. Scout had been duplicated and absorbed. Her life was next. "We need to organize the storage unit, Ben," she said, pulling on a beige jacket that looked suspiciously like Leonard's. "The yellow beetle is too loud. We'll take the silver sedan." Ben looked at her, truly seeing the transformation. He grabbed his keys and ran, fleeing the house, fleeing her. Alice watched him go, feeling only a placid sense of correction. She walked out to the curb and crossed the street. "Leonard," she said, her voice even, appreciative. "Alice," Leonard replied, the first time he had ever used her name. He handed her Scout's leash. "The disorder has been contained," he said. "The template is ready. You may proceed." Alice took the leash, Scout nuzzling her hand with his perfectly tattooed ear. She looked back at number 14, now seeing it through Leonard's, or perhaps her new, corrected eyes, an inefficient mess of purple and chaos. She looked at number 15, Leonard's house, which now held a perfect, pristine version of her life, ready for her to step into. It was beautiful. It was flawless. It was no longer hers, but it was better. Leonard stepped past her and into her house, number 14. He didn't lock the door. He didn't need to. The original house had been rendered empty, a husk of lost identity. Alice stood on the curb, the copy in hand, and watched the fading sun set over the perfectly matched cerulean blue mailboxes, realizing that Leonard had never wanted to drive her away. He had only wanted to perfect her life and then give her the keys to his perfect version of it, forever trapping her inside the flawless, mirrored cage of the copy. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.